الحمد لله الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعد وبعد. Alhamdulillah, inshallah, today we will be covering from 562 to 662. There is a typo at the beginning. It states 656, but it should actually read 662. Okay? Now, in looking at where we left off, we stopped at the death of Shaykh al-Islam Abdul Qadir al-Jilani, rahimahullah. We stopped at his death. After his death, the following scholars took over, and they were 4 in number, people that he had given khilafah to as his successors in his knowledge. They were Muwafiquddin ibn Qudama, rahimahullah. He died after the remaining crusades, and we'll be talking about him shortly. He absorbed Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's hadith knowledge and his fiqh knowledge. Okay. The next alim was Abdul Rahman ibn al-Jawzi, who, as we mentioned, is a direct descendant of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Imam Muwafiquddin ibn Qudama is the direct descendant of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He inherited Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani's jarh wa ta'dil, his grading of hadith, his understanding of hadith. The next was Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, a direct descendant of Umar ibn al-Khattab. He is written on record as having memorized and being tested and being at the level of 700,000 ahadith. 700,000. That places him in terms of his hifz at the level of the students of Imam Ahmad. All right, he could have sat in the classes of the students of the 4 Imams. That's the level that Shaykh Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi was at. He used to pray 300 extra nafil a day, just as glorification to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam Ibn Jawzi used to fast, and Imam Muwafiquddin combined between both. And you can see that in Imam al-Manini or Manni was an alim who specialized in the principles of ihsan. And these were his khulafa. These were his khulafa of his tariqah. Now, Shaykh al-Islam Abdul Qadir al-Jilani rahimahullah dies at 91 years of age and passes his successorship to those 4. The year 562 brought the great march of the general Asaduddin to take Egypt back from the Franks. The Franks had absorbed Egypt into their empire. He approached the Franks in battle from Lower Egypt. Now, this is an important point. In general, the Egyptians and the Greeks who met the Egyptians thereafter divide Egypt into 2 sections. Northern Egypt is called Lower Egypt. It's called Lower Egypt. South Egypt is called Upper Egypt, which is Sa'id Masr. Sa'id Masr. Northern Egypt is where you find personalities like Sheikh Umar Abdul Rahman, Muhammad Mutawalli Sha'rawi. South Egypt, you get Abu Ja'far al-Tahawi, Imam Mahmud Khalil al-Husri, and others. Okay? So he's coming from Lower Egypt, starting at Ad-Dumyat, near the Nile River, and moving up. When they met, there was great fighting, but in a shock victory, the Crusades were overwhelmed, and Asaduddin marched on and took Upper Egypt and consolidated it. So he moved from north to south. Remember, at this time, there was no Sudan. Sudan is a made-up idea from 1956. There was no Sudan. It's all Masr. Sudan was part of Sa'id Masr. I have cousins from Sudan. I have family from Sudan. They're Arabs. They speak the same dialect. They're Bedouins. Everything. Sudan is made up. Like North and South Korea is made up. Like Pakistan and India and Bangladesh are made up. They're not races. They are empires or states. It's fake. So Sudan at this point didn't exist. It was just Masr, all of it. So all the way up from northern Egypt by the port, all the way down to the termination of the Nile, in which it was called the Blue Nile. That's all Masr. That's all Masr. And then Somalia begins after that. So he makes it all the way and shocks the Crusaders and defeats them. The Franks then fall back to Cairo and then Alexandria, both places that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi had consolidated and added to his growing province of states. Al-Ayyubi was working on making a loose confederacy of Muslim provinces, and besides being the head of the Muslim military, he didn't want any other leadership positions. So at this time, the Abbasiyya were weak. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is trying to build and consolidate a Muslim confederacy, which is made up of all of the different Sunni Jama'at combining their forces into one. Because they're dealing with two main enemies. The Fatimiyya, which were the Ismaili, 12ers who controlled North Africa, and their masjids were facing Karbala. And number two, the Crusaders. They had to deal with both enemies. An internal enemy who insisted that they were Muslims, and an external enemy who insisted that they would cleanse the Holy Land of their areas. Be advised, as I did last lesson, that the Dome of the Rock was turned into Templum Domini, or Templum Seclorum. Once they invaded and took Jerusalem, they killed 100,000 people in one day, in some accounts eating some of the people. The Dome of the Rock was turned into Templum Seclorum, or Templum Domini, and Masjid al-Aqsa was turned into a palace for one of the rulers, and also a horse stable. So at this time, Muslims really couldn't even be in Jerusalem. And if you were, you risked your life. Any of the big ulama that were in Jerusalem at that point bearing the name al-Maqdisi, the Jerusalemite, Palestinians, left. They either lived in the foothills around it in cities like Safarin, Jama'iyya, or places like that, but they certainly were not in Jerusalem on a normal basis. So Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is creating this confederacy, starting with Egypt, then bits and pieces of Sham. And he and his brothers are the main ones putting all this together. At this time, the Arabs, for the most part, are finished. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi is a Kurd. His brothers, they're Kurds. In the east, it's the Turkish. The Arabs are finished, by and large. They are finished. This is the era of the Ajam, the non-Arab. And these are the people that are bringing the deen. Nur ad-Din Zenki gave Homs and its districts to his representative and deputy Asad ad-Din in the year 563 AH, and it remained in the hands of his children and their children for 100 years. So Asad ad-Din is the assistant and deputy of Nur ad-Din Zenki. And so when he's conquering, he's doing so on behalf of Nur ad-Din Zenki. Asad ad-Din had returned to Sham after securing Egypt, but the crusading Franks came back and he had to make a third campaign to stop them. This occurred in 564 AH. A great earthquake in 565 struck Sham, killing 80,000 people and damaging the Umayyad family masjid, the prisons around the area, and also the walls of Damascus itself. The area was almost completely destroyed. That's a very serious thing because Damascus is considered one of the most consistently and constantly occupied cities in the history of the world. The more you dig under the ground, you find buildings and buildings and buildings. You find almost no time where the city was desolate in its founding all the way up until now. So for Damascus to nearly be, or Dimashq in Arabic, to nearly be devastated to the point where no one could live there and it was uninhabitable is something severe. And for the Jami' al-Umawi, the Umayyad masjid, the Umayyad central family masjid to be damaged or nearly destroyed is also severe, because this is where in Sham, when you studied at a higher institution, that's generally where you went to. They were not as strict as, say, the Jami' al-Ashrafiyya, in which you were required to be an Ash'ari to attend those institutions. The Jami' Umayyah was attended by Shamsuddin ibn Qudama, who was a Hanbali in terms of his creed, but was mainly and by and large Ash'ari. So that institution produced imams like Imam Yahya al-Nawawi, the writer of the 40 Hadith, the Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. People like that studied there or visited there or taught there. And these were mainly Ash'ari institutions. But they were open and cosmopolitan to others, whereas Jami' al-Ashrafiyya was not. Now, further to this, the Abbasid Khalifa al-Mustanjid died in the year 566 AH at 48 years of age. He'd ruled for 5 years. After al-Mustanjid came his son al-Mustadi bi-Amrillah, the 33rd Abbasid Khalifa. It was around this same time that Nuruddin Zenki traveled to Sinaj, took control of it, and handed it over to his cousin Ibaduddin. And then he carried on and conquered al-Mosul. So if you look at the Khalifas at this time, they're succeeding to their different posts. But the people that are doing most of the legwork in terms of protecting the borders of Islam, raising the banner of Islam, protecting Islam, are people like the ulama, or the people under the ulama. This must be stated. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi was one of the ulama. His institution where he teaches at, and Allahu alam if it's still being used today, but it's not far from one of the satellite Azhar campuses in Egypt today, where he used to sit and teach at a chair as a theologian. He was a theologian, he was a soldier, he was a scholar, he was a historian, he was many different things. And so him taking control of a lot of the armies and passing out responsibilities was very significant, because the Kurds, when they came into the religion, they immediately adopted the Shafi'i school, and most of them adopted the creed books of the Ash'aris. So the Kurds to this day are by and large Shafi'is, and the theological books that they study will be books like al-Barahin, texts like that by Imam Sunusi and others. Al-Mustadi bi-Amrillah, the 33rd Abbasid Khalifa, was the one in charge during this time. In the year 567 AH, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi entered in and interrupted the khutbah of Al-Adid al-Ubaidi of the Fatimiyya of Egypt and removed him. After this, Al-Azhar from Egypt was taken and the Shia thrown out. The creed of use was to be that of the Ash'aris, most of its scholars being Shafi'i and fiqh. So in this year, at the Fatimi Central Masjid, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, rahimahullah, storms into the masjid. And I want you to understand how our scholars view the people of the cults and their organizations and their leadership. Interrupts the khutbah. He interrupts the khutbah. There was no feeling that he had for the sanctity of the khutbah or their place of worship or anything. He had no feeling for that. And so when he came in and disrupted that, he then removed him. He removed him from power because this particular ruler was the chief speaker for the Fatimiyya. So he removed him from power. Then he stripped Al-Azhar University of the Shia, whether they were Ismaili or Ithna Ashari 12ers. Whether they were 7ers or 12ers, he removed them from power. And he put in their place Azhar imams that were Shafi'is and that were Ash'aris. And that was the bottom line. Now, up until fairly recently, and by recently historically, I mean perhaps 400 or 500 years ago, Azhar had a strict principle in that if you attended their university, you had to adhere to one of the four madhabs. You were going to. And they would not admit you in the university unless you did. Their entrance forms up until the late 1980s, early 90s required you to indicate a madhab.